evening of August 19, 2022, two women named Tina Prescott, age 22, and Alina Reyes, age 21, took a photograph of themselves in a stand of pine at the edge of the Nahanni country in Canada's Northwest Territories. In the photograph, they are smiling, but 15 feet behind them, between two trunks, in the last of the light, Bigfoot is standing and watching them. Both women are on the missing persons register, and so are three of the men who later went looking for the truth of that photograph. That is where this begins, and in a sense, where it has already ended, because most of the people who ever touched this picture are gone now. And I want to be careful with that word. They are gone. And one of them, the man who started all of the searches, is still around, technically, still sending the occasional message, though I am no longer certain the messages are coming from where he thinks they are. What follows I have assembled from his account, from the check-in logs he kept, and from a case summary that was never meant to leave a desk.
It started with a picture, a selfie. Two young women in a pine forest at dusk, leaning into the frame the way people do. Both of them smiling, both of them unaware that 15 feet behind them, between two trunks in the last of the light, Bigfoot was standing and watching them do it. I need to tell you about the man who found that picture and what he did after he found it, because the picture is not the frightening part. The picture is just the door. What is frightening is the long, dark hallway on the other side of it, and how far down that hallway he decided to walk, and how many people he decided to send ahead of him into the black. His name does not matter, and he would not want me to use it, so I will call him the analyst, because that is what he did for a living. He read data for a living. He was the kind of man who could look at a file and tell you things about it that the file did not know it was telling, where a picture was taken, when, on what device. Whether the numbers all agreed with each other, or whether, somewhere in the quiet arithmetic of the thing, they did not. He found the selfie on a forum, one of those places where people post the strange and the unexplained, and argue about it into the night. Someone had put up the photo of the two young women with a title asking whether the shape in the trees was real. Most of the replies said stump, some said costume. A few said nothing at all, just came back to the thread over and over the way you worry a loose tooth. The analyst did what he always did. He pulled the file apart. The first thing he looked at was the metadata. Every digital photograph carries a hidden second photograph inside it, a record of itself, written by the camera at the instant the shutter fires. The time, the date, the settings, and if the device knows where it is, the place. Latitude and longitude, written down to a precision that would frighten most people if they understood how faithfully their pictures remember where they have been. The selfie carried a location. That was the first thing that was wrong. It carried a clean location, a precise one, a set of coordinates written with the confidence of a phone that knew exactly where it stood. And when the analyst dropped those coordinates onto a map, they did not land in Oregon where the trees look like they might belong. They landed far to the north. They landed in Canada. They landed in the Northwest Territories, in a stretch of country along the South Nahanni River, so remote that most of the people reading this will never in their lives come within 300 miles of it. He knew that country by reputation, the way people know the names of deep parts of the ocean. He knew that there were no towers out there, no signal, no network for a phone to reach out and touch to learn its own position. It was one of the largest dead zones on the continent, a place where a modern phone becomes a very expensive flashlight, blind to everything but the ground under its own feet. And yet the file knew exactly where it was. A phone that could not have known where it stood had written down to a precision of a few feet exactly where it stood. That was the contradiction that caught him, the loose tooth he could not stop touching. It was not possible. And because it was not possible, and because he was the kind of man who could not leave a thing alone once it refused to make sense, he decided he was going to find out how a blind camera had seen so clearly. He could not do it from his desk. That was the trap. And he walked into it the way careful men often do, one reasonable step at a time. You cannot confirm a coordinate in a dead zone by looking at a screen. Someone has to stand on the spot. Someone has to go there to the actual dirt and hold a device up and see whether the numbers agree. It is the most ordinary thing in the world, the desire to check your work. It is how he ended up sending a man to the edge of the map. But before he sent anyone, he read. He was thorough. Before he would send a person into a place, he wanted to know the place. And so he spent his evenings learning the valley, and the valley began to tell him things he did not like. The stretch of the South Nahanni his coordinates pointed toward had a name. On the old maps and in the older stories, it was called Deadmen Valley, and it had earned the name honestly. In the early years of the last century, men went into that country chasing gold, the way men did then, walking into the unmapped after the promise of it. Around 1908, it was said 2 brothers went up the river after that promise. Prospectors, and when they were finally found, so the record went, they had been found dead in the snow. What the story fixed on, what turned a tragedy into a legend, was that they had reportedly been found without their heads. The analyst told himself this was folklore. He told himself that the wilderness of a century ago killed men in 100 ordinary ways, and that fear did the rest, dressing exposure and starvation and misadventure in something more satisfying to tell around a fire. And that was a reasonable thing to tell himself. It was also, he would later come to feel, exactly the wrong lesson, because the record did not stop at the brothers. Others went in after them across the decades that followed. Some were found dead, some were found in the ashes of cabins that had burned for no reason anyone could name, and some were not found at all, and the river kept them, and the valley closed over the place where they had been like water closing over a stone. There was a trapper decades on from the brothers who was found in the burned-out shell of his own cabin. The fire unexplained, the man inside it in a valley where he had lived alone and careful for years. There was a party of men who went up the river and came back one short, and could not agree in their tellings on where along the water they had lost him, as though the place where it happened had refused to be remembered. There was a prospector who kept a journal, and whose journal was recovered though he was not, and whose final entries, the analyst read, grew stranger as they went, the handwriting steady but the content coming loose, describing a valley that watched him, and a stretch of days he could no longer account for, and a face at the edge of his fire that he described over and over and could not make himself finish describing. The analyst read the fragments the way he read everything, looking for the seam where the numbers stopped agreeing. And what he found was that the numbers did not stop agreeing so much as they stopped applying. These were not deaths that added up. A man dies of exposure and you find him. A man drowns and the river gives him back downstream in a week, in a season, but it gives him back. The Nahanni did not give people back. It took them cleanly out of the accounting, the way a figure gets erased from a ledger, and what was left behind was never the body but the belongings, the cabin, the journal, the gear, the ordinary evidence that a person had been keeping the small appointments of a life right up until the valley decided they would keep no more. He read all of it, and the reasonable voice in his head, the one that had said folklore, grew a little quieter with each account, until one night he understood the pattern that had been bothering him and could not ununderstand it. His coordinates had not landed somewhere random. His blind camera had not written down the location of a parking lot or a suburb or a stretch of ordinary woods. Of all the places on the whole turning earth that a phone might impossibly have known, it had written down the one place that had been swallowing people for 100 years. That was when he should have closed the file. He has said as much in the few things he has said. That was the night to walk away. Instead, he hired the first man. I will call the first man the tracker because that was the shape of his life. He was bush capable in the way very few people are anymore, a former guide, a man who had spent his years in country that did not forgive mistakes and had made his living by not making them. When the analyst laid the job out, the tracker did not flinch at the remoteness. Remoteness was his profession. Go to the coordinates, confirm them, photograph the spot, come home. Good money for a competent man to do a simple thing in a hard place. They flew him in. There is no other way. A float plane set him down on the water and lifted off again, and the sound of the engine faded. And then there was the silence that comes to those places when the last machine is gone. The silence that is not really silence, but the sound of a great deal of country with nothing in it that cares whether you live. He checked in by satellite phone on a schedule they had agreed. The first calls were ordinary. He described the country, the difficulty of the ground, the progress he was making toward the coordinates. A professional's reports, dry and specific. The analyst has kept them, and in the early ones you can hear a man doing his job. Then the reports began to change, and the change was not what you would expect. He did not report fear, not at first. He reported an absence. He said there was no game, none, no sign of animals at all, not tracks, not scat, not the small movements at the edges of things that fill any living forest. He said the woods were empty in a way he had never encountered in a lifetime of woods, that he could stand still and listen and hear nothing at all, no birds, no insects, nothing, as though the country had been switched off. He said it was the quietest place he had ever stood, and he did not say it like a man describing peace. On the third day, he reported something small that the analyst did not think much of at the time and has thought about a great deal since. He said his compass would not settle. He said the needle drifted slow and steady, refusing to hold north, swinging by a few degrees over the course of an hour and then swinging back, as though something under the ground or in the air of the place were pulling at it gently and would not stop. He was an experienced man, and he knew that iron in the rock could do such things, and he said so, and he corrected for it and moved on. But he mentioned it. In a report otherwise full of terrain and progress, he mentioned that the country would not let his instruments tell him plainly where he was. On the fourth day, he reported that he had found tracks. This was the first sign of any living thing he had noted since the plane left, and he reported it almost with relief until he described them. They were not tracks he knew. They were long, he said, far longer than a man's, pressed deep into ground that his own boots barely marked, spaced in a stride that he could not cover without breaking into a run. He followed them a short way because that was his nature, and he said they went to the edge of a stand of spruce and simply stopped, both feet together, as though whatever had made them had reached that spot and gone no further and yet was not there. No return trail, no sign of it climbing or turning. The tracks arrived at that place, and the maker of them did not leave it and was not in it. The last full report came at the edge of the coordinates. He said he had reached the place, or near it. He said he had the feeling of being watched, which he was careful to note was a common feeling in wild country and not one he usually indulged. He said the tree line at the edge of his camp seemed to move when he was not looking directly at it, and to be still when he was. He said he did not like it. He said he would confirm the spot in the morning and start back. There was no morning report. There were no more reports. When enough scheduled calls had gone by with nothing on the other end, the analyst did the only thing he could do from 1,000 miles away. He raised the alarm and a search went in. Because that is what the modern world does. It sends good people after the lost. They found the camp. They found it intact, which was its own wrongness. The gear squared away, the fire long cold. Everything in the ordered state. A careful man leaves things in. They found all of it, in fact, except the man. The tracker was not there. The tracker was not anywhere. The most competent person the analyst had ever hired had walked into that valley, and the valley had taken him and left his belongings behind like something it had no use for. The analyst did not sleep well after that. Who would? And in the not sleeping, he went back to the record, deeper this time, past the prospectors, and into the accounts he had skimmed and set aside. And now that he was looking for it, he found the shape in all of them. Across the decades, in the fragments people had left behind, there were descriptions, not of a bear. Bears were named as bears by men who knew them. This was named as something else, something that stood upright and stood too tall, over 7 feet, with a face the witnesses kept struggling to describe because it was not the face of an animal. A flat, wide, human-like face, they said, with a heavy ridge of bone above the eyes and no muzzle at all. Rust-brown hair going to gray at the edges, eyes that caught what little light there was and threw it back flat. They were describing Bigfoot, a century of frightened people in a valley that ate the ones who saw it, describing Bigfoot again and again without ever meaning to, without ever having a word ready for what they had seen. The descriptions had a consistency that unsettled him more than variety would have. Men separated by decades who could not have read each other, who left their accounts in journals and depositions, and the recollections of the families they told, all reached for the same details. The height, always over 7 feet. The way it stood, upright and patient. The face that was almost a person's face and was worse for being almost. One old account, the one that stayed with him longest, described how Bigfoot had stood at the tree line across a clearing and simply watched a man work for the better part of an hour, making no move toward him and no sound, until the man could not bear it and looked away to gather himself. And when he looked back, the clearing was empty and there had been nowhere for anything that large to go. That was the detail that recurred, not violence. Watching, and then an absence that the country could not account for, a departure with no direction to it. It was on the forum that the other idea took hold, the one the analysts never accepted and never quite escaped. The people in that thread, the ones who kept coming back to the photo of the 2 young women, had a theory about the valley and about Bigfoot. They argued that the reason the Nahanni never gave anyone back, the reason there were so rarely remains, so rarely a body, so rarely anything at all, was that Bigfoot did not leave remains because Bigfoot had never been made entirely of the stuff that remains are made of. They argued that it moved through the valley the way the analyst's data had moved through a dead zone, present without a signal path, here without any ordinary way of being here. That the place and Bigfoot were not 2 facts but one. That you cannot recover what was never fully in the world to begin with. That a track can arrive at the edge of a spruce stand and stop, both feet together with no trail leading away, because the maker of it did not walk away at all but simply ceased to press upon the world at that spot, the way a signal drops, the way a file corrupts, the way a man in a valley stops sending reports in the middle of an ordinary sentence. The analyst was a man of numbers. He did not believe in ghosts or gates or other realms. He did not believe that Bigfoot was anything more than an animal that science had been slow to catalog, if it was anything at all. But he had a file on his desk that a blind camera should not have been able to write, and he had a tracker who had walked into an empty forest and simply stopped being, and he had a set of long tracks that arrived at a stand of spruce and did not leave it. And the theory sat in the corner of the room where he worked, and it would not leave, and he could not make the numbers argue it out the door. He hired a second man. I have thought a great deal about why. I think it was because he could not accept the alternative, which was that the first loss meant something, that there had been a reason, that the valley had a will, a random tragedy he could bear, a pattern he could not. So he sent a second man to prove the first had simply been unlucky. This one I will call the skeptic because he took the job in the spirit of debunking it. He did not believe in the valley's reputation, and he said so. He thought the tracker had gotten turned around and died of the ordinary things that kill people in the wild, and he intended to go in, reach the coordinates, and come back with a dull and reasonable account that put the whole business to rest. He was better equipped than the first man. He checked in more often. He treated the assignment as a problem to be solved, and the fear around it as a thing to be corrected. And his reports did not become frightened either. They became wrong. The times began to drift. A message the analyst received in the evening would carry a stamp from the following morning. A report would arrive before the one that should have preceded it. Small things, the kind of things you blame on the satellite link, on the cold, on the equipment, until there are too many of them to blame on anything. The skeptic's accounts stopped agreeing with each other. In one call, he described weather that contradicted the call before. In one, he described terrain that did not match where he was supposed to be. The analyst listening had the sensation of a man whose reports were coming loose from time itself, sliding around on the surface of the days like something that had lost its grip on when it was. Then, the skeptic began to report the same day twice. He would describe reaching a particular bend in the river, a particular fall of rock, the setting of his camp in a particular clearing, and 2 days later, he would describe reaching it again for the first time, the same bend, the same rock, the same clearing, with no memory in his voice of having been there before. The analyst tried to raise it with him on a call, tried to tell him gently that he had described this place already, and the skeptic did not understand the question, grew irritated by it, insisted he had only just arrived. It was as though the valley were folding his days back over one another, running him through the same stretch of ground more than once and letting him keep none of it. He reported once that he had found a camp, not his own. An old one, he said, a cold fire ring and squared away gear and a satellite phone left sitting on a rock. Everything in the ordered state, a careful man leaves things in and no one anywhere near it. He said he did not like the look of it and would not touch it. The analyst knew, listening, whose camp it was. He knew it was the tracker's camp, found intact and empty months before and left where it lay because there had been nothing to recover. But the search had been a long way from where the skeptic now was or was supposed to be, and there was no reason the two men's paths should have crossed that particular ground. The skeptic was finding things that had happened to someone else, in a place he should not have been, as though the valley kept its dead close together and did not much mind the order of them. He stopped sounding like himself around the 9th day. The irritation left his voice and something flatter came into it. He spoke more slowly. He described the country now with a kind of admiration that frightened the analyst worse than fear would have, calling it beautiful, calling it quiet, saying he understood why a person might not want to leave it. He had gone north a skeptic determined to prove the valley ordinary, and somewhere in the folding of his days, the valley had stopped being a thing he was investigating and become a thing he was joining. And then, in the last coherent message, the skeptic said something that stopped the analyst's blood. He said he could see the two young women. He described them. He described the Selfie, the exact scene of it, the pines and the dusk, and the two of them leaning into the frame as though it were happening in front of him, now live, a thing years old occurring in his present. He said they did not seem to know he was there. He said there was something behind them in the trees and he was going closer to see it. The next message was not a message. It was a sign-off, the ordinary kind, a man saying he would check in again at the usual time. It was calm. It was routine. It was the last thing anyone ever heard from him. And it has always been the calm of it that the analyst cannot get past, that the man went quiet not in terror but in the middle of an ordinary sentence, as though he had simply been lifted mid-word out of the conversation and out of the world. By now the analyst was not a well man. You do not send two people into a place and lose them both and remain the person you were. But he had crossed some line inside himself where stopping had become impossible, where the only way he could imagine living with what he had done was to understand it. And understanding required more data, and more data required another person. This is the logic that the valley, if it has a will, seems to prefer. It does not need to reach out. It only needs a man who cannot stop feeding it. And it had found one. The third man, I will not give a name of my own because the third man was given one by everyone. The third man made the news. He went in like the others and he did not come out like the others, and the difference was that this time the world noticed. There was a search, a real one, the kind with helicopters and volunteers and a family in front of a microphone. There was a photograph on the screen and a date beneath it, and a plea for anyone with information. For a few days, the disappearance of a man in a remote northern valley was a thing that ordinary people who had never heard of the analyst or his file, knew about and shook their heads over and forgot. The search for the third man ran longer than the others because the world was watching it, and it turned up more, and everything it turned up was wrong in the particular way the analyst had come to expect. They found his last camp. They found it far from where his own log position said he should have been, miles off, on the wrong side of a ridge no man could have crossed in the time available. They found his footprints leading away from it, clear and soft ground, and they followed them, and the footprints did what the trackers had done a year before. They went to open ground and stopped, both feet together, with no continuation and no return, as though the man had reached that spot and been lifted straight up out of his own stride and out of the search, and out of the reach of every helicopter and every volunteer and every camera pointed at his mother while she asked the country to give him back. The country did not give him back. The country does not. And here is where the pattern the analyst had been feeding revealed how old and how large it truly was. Because when the researchers who study these things looked at the case, they did not see it as one man lost in one valley. They saw it as the newest entry in a record that stretches across the wild places of the continent, a documented cluster of people who walk into certain kinds of country and are never seen again, a pattern cataloged most exhaustively in the missing 411 work of David Paulides. The analyst read that work in the nights after the third man made the news, and he understood finally and completely what he had done. He had not been investigating a strange photograph. He had been adding names to a list that was already very long, and the valley had been happy to let him. He tried, near the end of the time when he was still fully himself, to stop. He told me this in one of the last clear conversations we had. He said he had deleted the file. He had taken the selfie of the two young women and dragged it into the trash and emptied the trash and watched the little animation of it going away. And he had felt for an evening that he had closed the door at last. And then in the morning, the file was on his desktop again, where it always sat. The two young women leaning into the frame and Bigfoot behind them in the pines. He told me he did not remember restoring it. He told me he did not think he had. He said a file you delete does not come back on its own, that this is not a thing that happens, that he of all people knew exactly how impossible it was, and that it had happened anyway, and that this was the moment he understood the door had never been his to close because he had never been the one holding it open. That should be the end of it. A man does a terrible, well-meaning thing, loses 3 people to his own inability to leave a mystery alone, and is left to live with it. That would be a sad story, but a closed one. It is not closed. That is the part I have the hardest time with. Because the last time the analyst wrote to me, something was wrong with the message, and it was wrong in a way I recognized. The timestamp did not agree with when it arrived. The location data attached to it, the quiet arithmetic that every modern message carries the way every modern photograph does, placed him somewhere he says he has never been. Somewhere north. He has never gone to the Nahanni. He swears this, and I believe he believes it. He traced that valley from a desk a continent away and never once set foot in the Northwest Territories. But the data has started doing to him what it did to the file that knew where it was when it could not have. The reports that came loose from time. His messages arrive out of order now. I will get one in the afternoon, and the next will carry a stamp from the night before. And when I lay them out and try to read them in the sequence the timestamps insist on, they tell a slightly different story than the one I remember him telling. The way the skeptics' reports began to disagree with each other in the folding days of the valley. Last week, he wrote to me twice about the same evening as though each were the first time, the same meal, the same weather, the same small complaint. And when I gently pointed it out, he did not understand the question and grew irritated by it. And I heard in that irritation an echo I did not want to hear. And the location data, that is the part I cannot make peace with. Every message a modern phone sends carries a quiet record of where it was sent from. The same faithful arithmetic that betrayed the Selfie, and his messages have begun to place him north. Not far north at first, a little, and then a little more. I have watched over the weeks the coordinates attached to a man who swears he has not left his home migrate steadily up the map, out of the city where he lives, across the provinces, toward a valley he has never set foot in. Closing the distance to a set of numbers, he pulled off a photograph and could never bring himself to stop tracing. He is being filed. I do not have a better word for it. The valley is entering him into its record the way it entered the tracker and the skeptic and the man who made the news, except that it does not need his body to do it, because he gave it something better. He gave it his attention. He looked into that place so long and so hard that the place looked back and found the way home. And I find that I cannot tell him it is nothing, because I do not think it is nothing, and I do not think that a man has to walk into that valley in his body for the valley to learn the way to him. He gave it a signal path. He traced the coordinates so many times, so carefully, followed the thread of that place so far into the dark, that I am no longer sure which end of the thread he is holding. I have the Selfie still. The 2 young women in the pines, smiling, leaning into the frame, and behind them, between the trunks, in the last of the light, Bigfoot, over 7 feet tall, that heavy brow and that wide, flat, human-like face turned toward the camera, toward them, toward whoever would one day pull the file apart and follow it north. I have looked at that photograph more times than is good for me. And I will tell you the one thing I have never been able to make myself do. I have never checked its metadata. I have never pulled the file apart the way the analyst did. Because I am afraid that if I do, it will tell me where it was taken, precise to a few feet, confident as anything, and I'm afraid the coordinates will have moved. I'm afraid they will be a little closer to me than they were before. Real or fake, you decide.
There is a man alive right now who could tell you exactly what is on this footage and exactly what it means, but he will not. He came out of the Nahanni on his own 2 feet, which is more than most people can say. And the first thing he did when he got back to a place with roads and lights and other people was to make himself impossible to find. He changed his number, he sold his equipment, all of it, the cameras and the packs and the cold weather gear he had spent a career assembling. Sold it fast and cheap, the way you sell something you cannot stand to look at. He stopped answering the people who had known him for 20 years, and he left behind exactly one thing, one file, a few seconds of trail camera video that he recovered from that valley and handed over and never explained anything.
I have that footage. I'm going to tell you what is on it and how it came to exist, and I am going to tell you as much as anyone has been able to piece together about the days around it. But I want to be honest with you at the start about the shape of this story, because it is not the usual shape. The usual shape is that someone goes into the wild and does not come back, and the horror is in the not coming back. This is the other kind. This is the story of a man who came back, whole, unhurt, competent to the end, and who took one look at the life he had returned to and decided he wanted no part of any of it ever again. He survived, and surviving is the part that broke him. I will call him the contractor because that is what he was. He took jobs, difficult jobs in difficult country for people who needed something confirmed or recovered or documented in places most professionals would not go. He was bush capable in a way that is genuinely rare, a former guide, a man who had spent his working life in country that kills the careless, and had stayed alive by being the opposite of careless. He did not believe in much. He believed in preparation and in his own competence, and in the idea that any place on earth, however hard, could be entered and left by a person who respected it and did not make mistakes. The Nahanni was going to teach him that this last belief was wrong. The job came to him through an intermediary from a client he never met, a man he understood only as someone who worked with data and had gotten hold of something he could not explain from his desk. The brief was simple, and the money was good. There was a set of coordinates deep in the South Nahanni country, far past any road or trail, reachable only by air. The client wanted them confirmed. He wanted the contractor to go to the spot, document it, and deploy a set of trail cameras along the drainage to record whatever moved through it, and then come back out and some weeks later return to collect the cameras and their memory cards. Confirm a location. Set some cameras, retrieve them. For a man of the contractor's ability, it was almost insultingly straightforward. A large amount of money for a simple task made valuable only by the difficulty of the ground. He took it the way he took everything, without drama, as a problem in logistics. He studied the maps, he arranged the flights, he assembled his gear with the particular care of a man who has learned that in remote country the difference between a good trip and a dead one is often a single item packed or forgotten. And he read a little about the valley because he always read about the country he was going into. And what he read he set aside as the kind of story that attaches itself to any remote place. He knew the name, Deadmen Valley. He knew the old accounts, the prospectors who went up the river a century ago and were found dead, the 2 brothers who were reportedly found without their heads around 1908, the men who followed and burned in their cabins or simply were not found at all. He had been in a dozen places with stories like that. Every hard country has its dead and its legends, and the legends are usually just the dead dressed up to be bearable. He filed the Nahanni's reputation where he filed all such things in the drawer marked folklore. and he did not think about it again until the valley made him. They flew him in on a float plane. He watched the last of the settled world drop away beneath him, and then the country opened up, and even a man who had seen a great deal of wild country was quieted by it. It went on past any sense of scale. Mountains folded into mountains, the river a thin, bright thread at the bottom of it all, and no sign anywhere, not a road, not a cut, not a wire of any human thing at all. The plane put down on the water, and he unloaded his gear, and the plane lifted off again, and he stood on the shore and listened to the engine fade. And then he was alone in a way that few modern people ever are. Alone past any hope of quick rescue. Alone in a place where his own competence was the only thing between him and the ground. The first thing he noticed was the silence. And the first thing that troubled him was that the silence was too complete. He had been in quiet country before. Quiet country is not actually quiet. It hums with the small business of living things, birds at the edges of hearing, insects, the rustle of something small in the brush, the distant complaint of a raven. This did not hum. He stood on that shore and turned his good ear to the country and heard nothing at all. No bird, no insect, no movement, a silence so total that he could hear the blood in his own ears. And he had never in a lifetime of wild places stood anywhere so empty of life. He told himself it was the season. He told himself it was the hour. He did not entirely believe himself, but he shouldered his pack and started toward the coordinates, because that was the job, and he was a man who did the job. He reached the drainage the client had specified by the second day, and he set about his work. This was the part of the assignment that was purely his craft, and I want to dwell on it a moment because it matters to what came after. He was methodical. He was, by every account of the people who knew his work, one of the most methodical people in a profession that does not tolerate the sloppy. He chose his camera positions with care, along the game trails that should have laced a drainage like that, positioning each unit to cover an approach, checking each one's field of view, logging each location precisely. He did everything right. There was no error in his setup, no corner cut, no lapse. I stress this because when the footage came out of that valley, the easy thing to say was that he had made a mistake, that some equipment fault or some carelessness explained it. And there was no mistake. The man did not make mistakes. That is what makes the footage what it is. He set 8 cameras over 2 days. He noted as he worked that the drainage that should have been laced with game trails had trails but no game on them. The trails were there, worn into the ground by the passage of many animals over many years. And there were no animals. No fresh sign, no droppings, no beds, no tracks less than seasons old. It was as though the animals that had made those trails had all left at once some time ago, and nothing had come to take their place. He set his cameras on trails that led from nowhere to nowhere, watching for movement, in a valley that seemed to have been emptied of anything that could move. There was one more thing he noted in those first 2 days, and he noted it the way he noted everything, without alarm, as a fact for the log. His instruments would not settle. His compass drifted, the needle refusing to hold a steady north, swinging slowly off true over the course of an hour and then drifting back. And his handheld positioning unit, the device he relied on to know precisely where he stood, kept losing and regaining its fix, reporting him in one spot, and then, a moment later, 100 feet away, and then back. He had worked in country with iron in the rock that could pull a compass around, and he told himself it was that. But a man in his profession trusts his instruments the way he trusts his own hands, and a valley in which the instruments would not tell him plainly where he was, would not agree with each other or with themselves, was a valley that had taken something from him before he had even understood it was being taken. He was, for the first time in years, not entirely certain where he stood, and he did not like the feeling. And he set his cameras anyway because that was the job. The nights were the wrong kind of dark. He had camped under a great many skies, and he knew the dark of remote country, which is not really darkness at all, but a deep blue crowded with more stars than city people believe exist. This dark was not that. The sky over the drainage seemed lower than it should have been, close and starless, as though the valley were roofed and the dark under it was total, a black without any gray in it. And his own fire seemed unable to push it back more than a few feet, the light dying at the edge of the flames as though the country were drinking it. He sat those first nights at a fire that lit almost nothing and listened to a silence that held almost nothing and told himself over and over in the calm, methodical voice he trusted that all of it had ordinary explanations and he was a good enough liar to himself to almost sleep. The first strange thing happened on the third night, and it happened to his camp. He woke in the small hours to no sound, which was itself the wrong thing to wake to, and he lay still in his tent the way an experienced man does, taking inventory of the dark before moving. And he became aware slowly that something about his camp was different. When he finally emerged in the gray of dawn, he found that his gear had been moved, not taken, not damaged, moved. Items he had stowed in one place were in another. His pack, which he had leaned against a particular rock, sat squared in the center of his cleared ground. Small things had been rearranged with what looked almost like care, set out in an order he had not left them in, as though something had come into his camp in the night and handled his belongings and set them back down, not where they had been, but where it wanted them. He examined the ground for tracks and found none, on soil that should have held them, and he stood in the cold light and understood that a thing had walked into his camp while he slept and touched his equipment and left no mark of itself, and that a man who leaves no mark on ground that should hold it is doing something that men cannot do. He was not yet frightened. He was a professional, and a professional's first response to the inexplicable is not fear, but method. He told himself reasonably that he had misremembered where he had stowed things, that fatigue and cold play tricks, and he did not fully believe it, but he wrote it down and moved on because the job was to retrieve the cameras, and the cameras were not yet ready to retrieve. He needed them to record. So he waited, and he ran his lines, and he tried not to think about the arrangement of his own gear laid out in the dawn like an offering, or a message, or a demonstration. He pulled the first card on the 5th day. And this is where I have to tell you about the footage, because the first card is the one that has it. The few seconds that the contractor carried out of that valley, and that I have watched more times than I should. The camera had fired in the night, tripped by motion as it was built to do. And for most of the clip, there is nothing, the ordinary gray-green of infrared dark, the trunks of the trees, the empty trail. And then Bigfoot walks into the frame. There is no other honest way to describe it. It comes from the left, unhurried, and it fills the frame as it comes because it is close. Closer than anything should get to a camera it does not know is there. And it is enormous, well over 7 feet. And it stops directly in front of the lens and lowers its face toward it. And the camera, for a moment, shows you everything. The heavy ridge of bone above the eyes, the broad, flat, human-like face with no muzzle to it, more the face of some old idea of a man than the face of any ape. The hair going gray and white around a face that is not young, one eye catching the infrared and throwing it back in a flat, bright disk of reflected light. It looks into the lens, it knows the camera is there. It has walked up to the one made thing in that entire empty valley and put its face against it deliberately, the way you would lean in to look at something you found interesting, and for a moment it and the camera regard each other across a few inches of cold air. And then the footage stops obeying reality. I do not know how else to say it. Up to that instant, it is an ordinary trail camera clip of an extraordinary subject. And at the moment Bigfoot lowers its face fully to the lens, the recording comes apart. The timestamp in the corner, which had been counting forward the way timestamps do, begins to count backward. The frame smears, not with the ordinary blur of motion, but with something else. The image pulling and doubling as though the camera were trying to record two different moments at once and could not decide between them. For a few frames there are two faces where there should be one, overlaid, offset, and then there are none. The image blowing out to a white nothing, and then it returns for a single frame showing the empty trail with no creature on it at all. The timestamp now reading a moment that had already passed minutes before, and then the clip ends. Bigfoot does not walk out of the frame, it does not turn and go. It is there at the lens, filling everything, and then the recording simply loses its ability to hold what it was seeing, and when it recovers, the trail is empty and the time is wrong. As though the act of getting that close to the lens had broken something in the relationship between the camera and the ordinary forward motion of the world. The contractor was a rational man holding in his hand a memory card that had recorded something that could not be recorded. And I think that was the moment the drawer marked folklore came open and would not shut, because a story is a story until it is on a card in your hand, timestamp running backward, and then it is a fact you cannot put down. He should have left then. He has never said so because he has never said anything, but I believe he knows he should have left then on the 5th day with the one card and flown out and never returned. He did not because the job was to retrieve all the cameras, and because a part of him, the professional part, needed to understand, and understanding meant staying, and the valley, if it works, the way the stories say, does not need to trap a competent man. It only needs to give him a reason to stay one more day. It had given him 7 more cameras. The footprints started on the 6th day. He found the first one beside his own. He'd been walking a line between camera positions in soft ground along the drainage, and he stopped to check his back trail as a careful man does. And there in the mud beside the neat single track of his own boots was another track, keeping pace with his. It was long, far longer than a man's foot, pressed deep where his own boots had barely marked, and it walked beside his own trail step for step. One print for every print of his, matched to his stride as though something had been walking directly beside him, close enough to touch, keeping exact time with his pace. And he had heard nothing and seen nothing and felt nothing. And it had been there the whole length of the trail he had just walked. He followed his own back trail then, fast, checking, and the double track was everywhere. Wherever he had walked that day, the long prints walked beside him, patient, matched, near, not following, beside. A follower leaves prints behind you. These were level with his own, the whole way, as though for the entire day he had walked that valley with a companion at his shoulder, that he could not see and could not hear, and that left its feet in the ground beside his, and took care to match him step for step. He stood over that double trail and felt, for the first time in a career of hard places, genuinely afraid, because a thing that walks beside you all day unseen is not stalking you. It is escorting you, and a thing does not escort you toward anything good. He tried the next day to test it. This was the professional in him, refusing to simply be afraid, needing to turn the fear into data he could handle. He walked a fresh line, deliberately over clean ground he had not crossed before, and he stopped often and looked down and beside his own prints. Keeping pace was the long, deep track, and it had been there since the first step, and there had been nothing to see and nothing to hear. He tried walking in tight circles, doubling on himself, changing pace, stopping dead. The track did all of it with him, matched to him, a print for every print, as though whatever made it knew what he was going to do before he did it, and was already doing it alongside him. He could not lose it, and he could not catch it, and he could not, by any test he devised, make it fail to be there. It was as constant as his own shadow and as impossible to face. After that, the valley stopped bothering to hide. The prince came into his camp each night now, and each morning he found them in a ring around his tent, close, the long, deep tracks circling the thin fabric he slept inside, coming near enough that whatever made them could have reached down and opened the tent with no effort at all, and choosing not to. The ring drew tighter as the nights went on. The first morning, the tracks circled at the edge of his cleared ground. A few mornings later, they circled at arm's length from where his head had lain. And on one morning, he found a single long print pressed into the ground directly against the wall of the tent, at the exact spot where his face had been through the night, toe pointed inward, as though something had stood over him in the dark with only a layer of thin fabric between its foot and his sleeping face. And it stood there long enough to leave its weight in the ground, and had then stepped back and resumed its patient circling. He heard nothing in the nights. That was the worst of it. He apparently told the one person he spoke to before he went fully dark. There was never any sound, not a footfall, not the crack of a branch, not the drag of breath, nothing that an animal of that size moving over that ground should not have been able to avoid making. Only in the morning, the record in the mud of how close it had come, and how long it had stayed, and how carefully it had circled him while he slept. An animal the size of which cannot move in silence, moving in perfect silence all night, around the sleeping man it was keeping. He stopped sleeping much after the print against the tent wall. He would lie awake in the black listening for a sound that never came, and in the morning the fresh ring would be there anyway, drawn around him in the night by something he had lain awake straining to hear and had not heard at all. And he began to understand that his waking and his sleeping made no difference to it, that it would come as close as it wished whenever it wished, and that the only thing keeping the thin fabric between them intact was a decision being made, each night, by something on the other side of it. The days stopped adding up somewhere in the second week. He would set out to service a camera he could reach by noon and arrive at dusk, having walked ground he did not remember walking, with hours gone from the day that he could not account for. His watch and his log positions disagreed with his own sense of the time and the distance, and he was far too experienced to lose hours in familiar terrain, and yet the hours went. He described later, second-hand, third-hand, the feeling of the valley folding under him, of covering the same ground more than once without meaning to, of the drainage seeming larger walking out than it had walking in. The place was not letting him keep his days, it was taking them quietly the way it had taken the game and the sound and the marks his own gear should have left, and giving nothing back. There was a day he could not place at all. He recorded in his log the servicing of a camera on what he marked as the 11th day, and then his next entry was marked the 13th, and between them was nothing. No entry, no memory, a whole rotation of light and dark that he could not summon back no matter how he tried. A man does not misplace a day. He can lose an hour to fatigue, a stretch of trail to distraction, but not a full turn of the sun, not with food eaten from his stores that he did not remember eating, and a camera moved to a position he did not remember choosing, and his own handwriting in the log for the 11th day describing weather he had no recollection of standing in. He had been somewhere and done things and been returned to himself with a record of it in his own hand, and no experience of it in his head. And the not knowing of where he had been on the day the valley took from him was, he apparently said, the thing that finally convinced him the folklore drawer was never going to close again, because whatever had emptied that day out of him had reached past his instruments and past his camp, and into the one place he had always believed was his alone and had helped itself. And then there was the thing he saw, the one thing, the threshold. I do not know exactly what it was, and I want to be careful here, because this is the center of the whole story, and it is the part he has guarded most completely. Everything else has come out sideways, through the one person he spoke to, through the footage, through the wreckage of his abandoned life. But what he actually saw on the day he decided to leave, he has never described to anyone, and I think that silence is itself the most honest description he could give. Whatever it was not a chase and not an attack. Nothing came at him. He was not hurt. By every account, he was never in physical danger at all, right to the end. What happened on that last day was that he saw something in that valley with his own eyes in full daylight that his mind could not file, something that did not fit any drawer he had, something so completely outside the rules he had lived his whole competent life inside of that. The competence itself, the thing he trusted more than anything in the world, simply had nothing to say about it. The little that leaked suggested involved Bigfoot and involved the way it left, and that the leaving was the impossible part. That he watched it, at close range, in good light, in a place with nowhere to go, and that it did not go anywhere. It was there, entire, real, as solid and present as the rock and the trees. And then it was not. And there had been no step between the two states, no turning away, no moving off into cover, nothing his eyes could follow or his mind could hold. It stopped being where it was without ever being anywhere in between. And a man who has built his whole life on the idea that the world runs on rules cannot watch a thing that large simply cease to press upon the world and remain the man he was. Something in him gave way that day, quietly, permanently, the way a load-bearing thing gives way. And he understood in the giving that he was not equipped to be in that place, that no one was, that competence and preparation and respect for the country were words that did not apply to whatever the Nahanni actually was, and that his only remaining task on earth was to get out of it while it still, for reasons of its own, allowed him to. He abandoned the 7 cameras. This is a small thing, and it is not a small thing. A man like that does not leave gear in the field. It offends everything in him. He had come to retrieve 8 cameras, and he walked out with 1 memory card and left 7 cameras standing in that valley for the rest of time, recording an empty drainage no one will ever come to collect them from, because getting to them would have cost him minutes. He was no longer willing to spend inside that place. The professional who documented everything, who finished every job, who did not make mistakes, left his work in the field and ran, and did not look back, and has never gone back and never will. The extraction is the one ordinary part of the story. The plane came on the scheduled day. He was at the water when it landed. He loaded what little he had kept, and he got in, and it lifted off, and the valley dropped away below him the way it had opened up before him weeks earlier, vast and folded and empty, and he watched it go and did not feel relief, because relief was not the thing. He had gotten out. He was one of the few who ever had. And instead of relief, there was only the certainty, settling into him as the country shrank behind the plane, that he had seen the far edge of the world he understood, and that he was going to spend the rest of his life on the wrong side of it, knowing what he now knew. He delivered the job to the letter. That is the last thing he did as the man he had been. He met the intermediary. He handed over the 1 card, the one with Bigfoot at the lens and the timestamp running backward and the trail going empty in a single impossible frame. He said nothing about the 7 he had left. He collected what he was owed. And then he executed the plan he had clearly made somewhere on the flight south. The changed number, the sold gear, the 20-year friendships dropped without a word, the deliberate and total disappearance of a man into the ordinary world, which turns out to be as good a place to vanish as any valley if you want it badly enough. Later, the researchers who cataloged these things would take an interest, because the case had the shape they know: a remote northern valley with a long record of the missing and the dead. A drainage that shows up when you know to look in the great documented list of such places that David Paulides has assembled in the Missing 411 work, the map of the wild country of the continent marked with all the spots where people walk in and do not walk out. The contractor's story is not in that record because the contractor did walk out and told no one, and made himself into a man with no story to add. But the valley is in the record, the Nahanni is in the record, and he is one more person who learned by going there that the record is not superstition and not coincidence, but a true accounting of a real pattern, and that the pattern is patient, and that it does not always need to keep you to change you. So the footage is what is left. A few seconds of Bigfoot walking up to a trail camera in the emptiest valley in the north, putting its ancient, not quite human face to the lens, and breaking the recording simply by getting close to it. The time running backward, the image coming apart, the trail going empty in a frame that should not exist. That is all we have, because the one man who could tell us the rest looked at what the rest cost and decided that silence was worth more than money, more than reputation, more than the relief of ever being understood. I have watched it many times. And the thing I keep coming back to is not the face at the lens, terrible as it is. It is the last frame, the empty trail, the wrong time. Because a camera does not run backward. A recording does not lose its grip on when it is. Whatever walked up to that lens did not just let itself be filmed. It reached through the one made thing in that whole dead valley, and it touched the machinery of the ordinary world, the plain forward motion of time itself, and it bent it, the way the valley bends the days of the men who walk in, the way it bent a careful professional into a man who sold everything he owned to be free of one memory. He got out. Remember that. Of everyone this valley has touched, he is one of the few who got out with his life. And he would tell you, if he would tell you anything, that getting out was not the same as getting free.
Real or fake, you decide. I was Alex, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.